Beneath the city's polished marble and pulsing trains, a hidden world of tunnels waits, forgotten paths carved by ambition, silence, and something far colder than concrete. A death by scotch, a body with a train token on its chest, and a secret network that never should have been found. When greed is mapped like architecture, murder follows the blueprint. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you right now. Let me know in the comments. Settle in, because this mystery begins now. There are 3 things that can get Nero Wolfe to break his sacred routines: orchid emergencies, threats to his ego, and bad food. This morning, it was orchids, and judging by the vein in his forehead, it was serious. "It is an abomination," Wolfe said, glaring at the telegram as if it had insulted Horace's poetry. "They labelled Paphiopedilum sanderianum as Paphiopedilum loei. It is incompetence of the most degenerate kind." I sat across from him with my morning coffee, pretending to read the Gazette while watching the show. "You want me to call the freight desk and bark?" I asked. "No," Wolfe said, rising, like a bear considering whether to maul a picnic. "We go." I blinked. "We?" He nodded. "They will not allow release without visual confirmation. I must go in person." Now, let's get this straight. Nero Wolfe voluntarily leaving the brownstone before noon, for any reason short of arson or murder, is on par with a lunar eclipse wearing a tuxedo. But there he was, ordering Fritz to delay lunch, telling Theodore to keep the greenhouse humidifiers running, and glaring at me like I'd caused the mix-up myself. So, like a loyal second lieutenant with reservations, I got his coat. Getting Wolfe into a cab is like getting a rhino into a hammock. You can do it, but there are noises involved. He grumbled about fumes, angles, and humanity in general, but by some miracle of physics and cab upholstery, we reached Grand Central without either of us committing murder. Inside, it was the usual rush-hour opera. Tourists with too many cameras, commuters with too little patience, and a few hopeful pickpockets trying to decide who looked the most distracted. Wolfe looked around like he was touring a landfill. "Pfui," he muttered. "The acoustics are intolerable." "They were better last century," I said, guiding him toward the baggage area. But the clientele was still noisy and overdressed. He sniffed. "We will retrieve the crate and leave. I refuse to dine with oil fumes in my nostrils. Then I'll cancel our candle-lit lunch at the diesel depot." He didn't dignify that with a response. Instead, he settled himself in a bench near track 23, folding his arms like a disapproving Roman senator and commanding me to conduct the transaction with speed. So off I went, one eye on the freight clerk and the other on Wolfe, who already looked like he regretted every life decision since breakfast. It was while I was negotiating with a red-faced clerk who couldn't spell Paphiopedilum with a gun to his head that I noticed him, the man in the beige raincoat. Now, beige isn't a colour that inspires panic, but this guy had a hunch to his shoulders, a twitch in his step, and a general air of someone who didn't want to be remembered, which meant I made a mental note immediately. He didn't glance at anyone. He just glided toward a grimy steel door tucked behind a column marked personnel only. What made it interesting, aside from the vanishing act, was the fact that the door was labelled train room, access restricted. Train room. Grand Central hasn't had an operational train room in decades, and even when it did, it wasn't tucked away like a janitor's closet. I glanced back at Wolfe. He was still on the bench, arms crossed, scanning the crowd like it owed him a refund. Beige coat slid through the door and was gone. I flagged the clerk with a finger and took a few steps toward the door, just enough to note the worn brass handle and the lock that had seen recent use. The guy hadn't looked nervous, just precise. 2 minutes later, I had the crate and a receipt, signed in triplicate, notarized by Indifference. I was about to turn back toward Wolfe when the door creaked open again. This time, it wasn't beige coat. It was a conductor, the real kind, grey uniform, brass buttons, cap tilted just so. He looked like he'd just read his own obituary. He stepped out stiffly, eyes darting like he was counting exits, and brushed past me with a muttered, "The widow's package. Not supposed to be moved. Not today." I spun. "Excuse me?" But he was already swallowed by the current of foot traffic. I didn't feel like shouting "widow's package" in a train terminal, especially not with Wolfe watching, so I let him go. Still, it left a flavour. One of those phrases you don't forget, like arsenic in the soup or body in the library. The crate dug into my arms, but I took one last glance at the steel door. It was shut again. No sign of beige coat, just an empty hallway and a weird echo in my brain that smelled like trouble. I headed back toward Wolfe, who was inspecting his watch like it had betrayed him. Wolfe had that look he gets when a schedule is being violated. 9 minutes, he said as I approached. This is egregious. Your orchids are safe, I replied, setting the crate beside him. The label still thinks they're lowy, but I assured them that's slander. He grunted, rising with the elegance of a disgruntled mastiff. Let us leave. But my eyes drifted. One last check. The door, still closed. Beige raincoat hadn't exited. I would have seen him. In a station like Grand Central, people come and go like pigeons. But this guy had gone in and stayed in. And now, the door sat there like a question no one wanted to ask. Wolfe was halfway to the cab stand before he realized I wasn't beside him. Goodwin. I'm coming, I said, glancing back one last time. The door didn't open. Now I'm not the type to believe in ghosts. But when a guy walks into a sealed door and doesn't come out, and the only other person to emerge is a conductor muttering about a widow's package, you start to feel a certain tingle. I caught up to Wolfe just as he was frowning at a cab's license plate. The orchid crate thumped in the trunk. But my head stayed behind. I could have let it go, could have chalked up beige raincoat to a coincidence and the door to a janitor with delusions of grandeur. But curiosity is a disease, and I had the early symptoms. The next morning, while Wolfe was engaged in a heated discussion with Theodore about mist levels in the plant room, apparently 62% is heresy, I slipped out and returned to Grand Central. I didn't bring the crate. The hallway was still there, still dingy, still ignored. The door still read, "Train room, personnel only." And still, no one gave it a second glance. I walked up and gave the handle a test. Locked. The metal was worn, but not dusty. The scuff marks on the floor said it got use, recent use. I leaned in and listened. Nothing. Then, maybe a scrape? Faint. Could have been a rat, or my imagination, or something human. I knocked. Silence. Then, one faint sound. A breath? No. A shift of weight. I stepped back, ran my hand along the wall beside the door. No auxiliary panel, no alarm. This wasn't a room that wanted visitors, and if it was mapped anywhere, it wasn't on the blueprints the MTA lets the public see. I left, whistling softly. But in my chest, something tightened, because that room wasn't just locked. It was hiding. It was Tuesday, just after 11, and I was debating whether to crack open the case files from last month or crack open a bottle of Fritz's root beer when she walked in. She had legs like a novel you don't skim, and a black velvet coat that said Fifth Avenue even before she did. Her eyes didn't shimmer, they calculated. And when she looked at me, I felt like she was adding me up column by column. "Nero Wolfe, please," she said, voice low and civil, with just enough frost to keep you honest. I gestured toward the office. "Right through there. I'm Archie Goodwin. If he throws you out, I'll help you to your feet." She didn't smile. "I won't need assistance." By the time she reached Wolfe's desk, he'd already risen half an inch in his chair, a gesture that, for him, might as well be a curtsy. He gave her a glance that lasted exactly long enough to label, catalogue, and dismiss any attempt at deception. "I am Nero Wolfe. Please sit. State your name and purpose." She unbuttoned her gloves with military precision. "My name is Hester Marling. I'm recently widowed, and quite possibly followed." Now we were all listening. She didn't fidget. Most clients do. Instead, she pulled a slim leather case from her bag and produced a photograph, which she passed to Wolfe like it was a courtroom exhibit. It was a shot of a man in his 60s, tall, distinguished, and looking slightly bored in front of what appeared to be a large train set. "My husband, Raymond Marling," she said. "Real estate developer, dead 3 weeks. Coronary failure, according to the medical examiner." I looked at the photo. The train table behind him was no hobby shop layout. It looked like something built by a man with too much time, too much money, and an unhealthy love of city infrastructure. "He was obsessed with underground transit systems," she continued. "Not just modern subway lines. He studied abandoned tunnels, unused routes, secret infrastructure. The basement of our home was converted." Wolfe raised an eyebrow. "Into what?" "A train room," she replied. "Full scale. Maps, switching diagrams, lights, signal replicas. He met with former MTA personnel, at odd hours. I wasn't allowed downstairs when they visited." I shot Wolfe a glance, and he returned it without blinking. He was interested. He just wasn't ready to admit it. "Mr. Wolfe," she said quietly, "my husband built something. I think someone killed him for it." "I found him the morning after his last meeting," she said. "Collapsed in the train room. They ruled it a heart attack." "Did you believe them?" Wolfe asked. She hesitated. "At first. But the map was missing." "Map?" I piped up. She nodded. "A master layout of New York's complete underground system, past and present, compiled from blueprints, decommissioning records, and God knows what else. It was his prized possession. He locked it in a flat file cabinet with his initials etched into the brass." "And it vanished?" Wolfe inquired. "The same day he died," she said. "Drawer unlocked, cabinet empty. I didn't notice at first. His death was enough of a distraction. But once I started sorting the estate, I knew. And if I noticed, someone else probably did too." Wolfe drummed his fingers on the arm of his chair. "This is New York. Beneath our feet lies a spider's web of tunnels, most of them forgotten. To possess such a map would be powerful. It wasn't just a collector's item," she said. "Raymond called it his real project. And now he's gone, and so is the only thing he ever locked away." Wolfe narrowed his eyes. So did I. She uncrossed her legs, slowly, as if the words needed room. "About a week before he died," she said, "I heard him speaking on the phone. I wasn't supposed to hear." "What did he say?" Wolfe asked. "One phrase, quiet, almost muttered. 'Wilkson Tunnel.'" Wolfe didn't react, but I made a mental note in all caps. I hadn't heard of the Wilkson Tunnel, but if it was in his vocabulary, it wasn't a ferry terminal. "Have you brought this to the police?" Wolfe asked. "I told the medical examiner I wanted a second opinion," she said. "They humoured me. Nothing changed. I didn't mention the tunnel, or the map." "Wise," Wolfe said. "Too specific for amateurs, too vague for experts." She sighed. "I have money, Mr. Wolfe. I'm not here for comfort. I'm here because I know something's wrong, and because I think someone else knows it too." Wolfe glanced at me. I didn't nod, but I didn't shrug either. Then she dropped the next card. Wolfe sat back in his chair and closed his eyes, which, as I've noted before, is not him dozing off. That's when the real calculations start. After 20 seconds, he opened them again. "Mrs. Marling," he said, "your diction is orderly, your narrative is sequential, your tone is sober. I am inclined to believe you believe what you have said." She waited. She wasn't the type to leap at hope. "But," he continued, "you bring supposition, not substance. Your husband's death was certified as natural. No evidence has been presented to suggest otherwise. A missing map, a whispered tunnel, and suspicious meetings do not constitute an investigation. They constitute gossip." Her lips tightened. He added, "I am not in the business of ghosts, nor do I search for absent papers based on widow's intuition, however well phrased." "I see," she said. "I hope you do," he replied. "Good day." That was the dismissal. In Wolfe's book, that's a velvet guillotine. She rose slowly, nodded to him, and turned to me. Her exit was graceful, but she wasn't done. Not by a long shot. I walked her to the door, mostly out of manners and partly because I wasn't ready to stop listening. "You knew he'd say no," I said quietly. "I knew he might," she replied. "But I also knew you'd be curious." I raised an eyebrow. "Me?" She paused at the threshold and looked directly at me. Her voice was even. "Last night someone came to the house." "What kind of someone?" "A man," she said. 40-ish, grey overcoat, not local. He asked for Raymond. I told him Raymond was dead." His reaction? Oddly calm. Then he asked if Nero Wolfe's assistant, the one who snoops around, had been by yet. That stopped me cold. "Did he give a name?" "No, just smiled and said, 'He'll find the train room, he always does.'" Then he left. I stood there for a second too long. She stepped into the sunlight and descended the steps like a woman who'd just tied a ribbon around a bomb. Inside, Wolfe was already issuing Fritz a monologue about veal versus pork in lunchtime ragout, but my appetite had just left the building. It wasn't until she was halfway to her car that she turned and gave me one last volley. "Oh, Mr. Goodwin," she called back lightly. "In case your employer finds his conscience and his curiosity, I'm prepared to pay $40,000 for a definitive answer." "That'll buy a lot of veal," I said. "And one more thing," she added, almost casually. "My husband spent his final week researching the Grand Central Annex, said it held the key." I didn't reply, but I stood there long enough for Fritz to call me to lunch twice and Wolfe to ask if I'd fallen down the stairs. The annex, the train room, beige raincoat. This wasn't a case yet, but it was already a problem. The Marling estate was a respectable brick and bay window affair in Turtle Bay, the kind of house that tried to look humble, despite knowing damn well it had more square footage than moral restraint. The maid let me in with a nod that said she'd seen better days and worse visitors, then directed me to the basement. That's where the magic happened, or the madness, depending on your view of model railroads and dead husbands with architectural fetishes. The stairs creaked like they were auditioning for a haunted house. At the bottom, I stepped into a chamber that didn't so much resemble the MTA as absorb it. It was as if someone had shrunk the New York Transit Authority, added velvet, brass, and indirect lighting, and turned it loose in a man cave the size of a squash court. The walls were wood-panelled and lined with miniature trains, lit up like holiday decorations on amphetamines. Everything hummed faintly, the sound of obsession given an outlet and maybe a power supply. I exhaled slowly. If this basement could talk, I had a feeling it would say something uncomfortable, and not in English. Most model train layouts come with a few styrofoam trees, maybe a papier-mâché mountain if the owner's feeling ambitious. Marling had taken it several steps, and about $50,000 further. His setup included functioning brass levers, wall-mounted switchboards, signal replicas, and something that looked suspiciously like a dispatch relay from a forgotten corner of the 1930s. The walls were wallpapered with subway maps, not decorative knockoffs either. These were originals, coffee-stained, yellowed with age, edges curled like an old dog's lip. Some were marked in red pencil, others were dotted with tiny thumbtacks. He'd overlaid lines that didn't match any current route and circled specific intersections that hadn't existed since Fiorello LaGuardia had knees. There was something ceremonial about it. This wasn't a hobby. It was a blueprint of something sacred or dangerous. I ran a hand along the edge of the control panel. The metal was smooth and faintly warm. That's when my phone buzzed. It was Saul. One line of text, no punctuation. "Checking Wilkson lead. Back soon." The second buzz came 90 seconds later. "There's someone watching the house." And then, nothing. Now, Saul Panzer is many things. Tactful, tireless, tenacious. But he's not the type to go radio silent without a reason that starts with a corpse or ends in a cell block. When he dropped off the radar mid-investigation, my neck tightened like a bowstring. I shot back a text. "Where are you?" No response. Tried calling. Straight to voicemail. I stepped away from the panel and paced. The basement was still humming, but now it sounded like something was under the hum. Like an old engine turning over, reluctant and low. Back upstairs, I asked the maid if anyone had come by lately. She blinked and said a delivery guy had knocked last night. Didn't leave a package. Perfect. I debated calling Wolfe. The man doesn't like being interrupted while reading Pliny the Elder or berating Fritz for undercooking turnips, and I didn't have facts yet, just vibes. But if Saul had sniffed something near the Wilkson Tunnel and someone was sniffing back, we weren't playing with toy trains anymore. I went back down to take another look, this time with both eyes open. That's when I found the slot. It was tucked under the table, behind a trim panel near the far edge of the model map. A narrow drawer, almost flush, with just enough of a gap to tease the curious. Naturally, I opened it. Inside was a single envelope, yellowed, sealed with red wax that had crumbled like bad meringue. No stamp, no return address. Just a short message written in old fountain pen ink. For MG only. I cracked it open. You can call that unethical, but I call it self-preservation. When people start dying around envelopes, I prefer mine open and harmless. It was empty, bone dry. Not even a slip of paper or a dead spider. Either the contents had been removed, or someone was staging a performance. I turned the envelope over, sniffed the paper. Nothing. But the wax had a faint scent. Something herbal, maybe rosemary or juniper. For someone named MG, it sure was getting a lot of attention from AG. I folded it back, returned it to the slot, and stood. The air in the room had changed. Saul was missing, and I was finding breadcrumbs. When I got back to the brownstone, Wolfe was mid-lunch. Fritz had served up calf's liver with a sherry reduction that smelled like something a French duke would demand before dying. Normally, Wolfe would have been in his element, but there was a line between annoyed and perturbed, and Wolfe was straddling it like a man discovering a dent in his orchid pot. "Mr. Panzer," he said, dabbing his lips with a linen napkin, "has not reported in 6 hours. This constitutes operational negligence." "For him," I said, "that's practically an act of war." Wolfe scowled. "You have nothing substantive?" "Just vibes," I replied, "and an envelope marked MG that didn't come with a decoder ring." He resumed eating, but slower. Fritz hovered at the doorway, eyebrows twitching. "He was near the Wilkson lead when he vanished," I added, "and someone was watching the house." Wolfe set his fork down. That, in his world, is the equivalent of screaming. He didn't say another word, but the silence in that room wasn't just about liver. I gave Wolfe the courtesy of 2 hours before sneaking back to the Grand Central Annex. Not that I needed permission. I just didn't want to hear about the state of the tulip bulbs while trying to commit mild trespassing. The Annex, for those unfamiliar, is where old schedules, dusty freight crates, and ancient track maps go to die. But if Raymond Marling had spent his final week sniffing around down there, and Beige Raincoat Man had vanished into a sealed-off corridor, then I figured it was time I joined the ghost tour. I went in dressed like a mildly confused logistics manager. Clipboards are useful that way. For 20 minutes, I wandered corridors that smelled like rust and regret. Nothing. Then I found it. A side hallway marked clearance, track control. The lettering was faded, but the lock wasn't. I leaned in. Voices. Not words, just murmurs, close enough to be human. That's when the guards showed up. 2 of them. MTA uniforms. Young, bored, suspicious. "Hey," one called. "That's a restricted section." "I was told to check cable routing," I said, gesturing vaguely at the ceiling. "They weren't buying it. Time to move." I didn't bolt. Bolting is for amateurs and guilty parties. I did the next best thing. I looked annoyed and kept walking. By the time they decided whether to chase me or radio someone, I was halfway back to the main concourse with my jacket unbuttoned and my clipboard pointed like a compass. Still, the silence behind that door stuck with me. That low murmur, the scent of stale cigarettes, the faint click of something mechanical. Not noise you'd find in an abandoned section of a building that hadn't seen a train since Truman was in office. I exited Grand Central with no token, no blueprint, and no Saul. But I'd seen enough to know one thing. That fake train room in Marling's basement. It wasn't a tribute. It was a model. And someone was using the real thing, not for nostalgia, but for something sharp enough to kill over. I headed home. Wolfe was waiting. And the silence in his office was louder than anything I'd heard in that tunnel. The call came at 6:17 a.m., which is either very early or very late, depending on your relationship with alcohol and consequences. I'd been up, barely, debating whether Fritz's suggestion of an egg poached in mustard broth qualified as food or warning. Lieutenant Rowcliffe's voice on the other end had all the charm of a slipped disc. "You better come down to the West 45th Access Tunnel," he said. "Bring identification. And gloves." "Whose body?" A pause. "Panzer." I didn't shave, and I didn't tell Wolfe. Not yet. He was still upstairs, communing with his orchids and pretending not to care about the world's petty failures. The location was worse than described. Beneath a shuttered track loop from the 1930s, sealed up after the city realized it was more rust than rail. The MTA had reopened it recently for maintenance, but no one was supposed to be down there, not unless you had a key and a reason. Saul was in a closet meant for tools, padlocked from the outside. He was slumped on the floor, neck at an angle that didn't belong in nature. His eyes were open. He didn't look surprised, just finished. And someone had gone to the trouble of arranging the scene like it was meant to be found. They say strangulation is personal, but whoever took Saul out hadn't done it for intimacy. He'd been garroted with what looked like a silk scarf, navy blue, faint pinstripe, knotted with a neatness that said the killer either had military training or too much free time. That wasn't the worst part. Stuffed in his mouth, not shoved, just resting between his lips like a calling card, was a vintage subway token. Brass, circular, with the cutout Y for City of New York Transit. Issued sometime in the 1940s, back when a ride cost 15 cents and nobody locked murder victims in janitor closets. Rowcliffe stood over the body with his hands in his coat pockets and his mouth set like he'd bitten into something sour and permanent. "Whoever did this wanted a message sent," he muttered. "Yeah," I said. And Saul was the envelope. They bagged him like evidence and carried him out. I stood there 5 more minutes, staring at the corner where the closet met the tile. Not because I thought he'd get up, but because Saul Panzer had walked into that tunnel alone, and someone had made damn sure he didn't walk out. Kramer arrived at the brownstone like a thunderclap in a stiff collar. The front door banged open. Fritz flinched, and he didn't wait for a greeting before barking, "Where is he?" "In his chair," I said, trying to pretend rage doesn't affect his digestion. The inspector stormed past me with a folder under one arm and a scowl that could have warped steel. Wolfe, already seated with a bottle of beer, opened but untouched, didn't rise. He just raised an eyebrow, his version of ducking behind a barricade. Kramer dropped the folder on the desk. "Saul Panzer, dead, strangled. Your man. Your case. So what the hell were you two digging into that got him killed?" Wolfe's lips compressed to a single punctuation mark. "We were not engaged in any case, Inspector. I declined it." "Yeah? Tell that to the corpse." I stood silent, letting the temperature in the room do its thing. Fritz slipped out like a man avoiding crossfire. Wolfe didn't respond, but something behind his eyes had started to boil. When Kramer finally left, trailing threats, warnings, and a few insults that would have made a sailor blush, Wolfe didn't speak. He just stood, slowly, deliberately. Then he walked to the door of the plant rooms and disappeared behind. The glass like a man slipping underwater. That was Wolfe's version of mourning. No sobbing, no speeches, no fists through drywall. Just a silent retreat into a world of orchids, humidity, and names that sounded like obscure opera villains. I waited an hour. No movement. I waited too. Still nothing. Fritz brought me coffee and a sympathy look, which, coming from him, was basically a bear hug. Theodore passed through once and muttered something about overwatering Phalaenopsis hybrids. I didn't answer. By noon, the office felt like a chapel without a congregation. I didn't blame Wolfe for disappearing. Saul had been the best of us, efficient, loyal, sharper than any knife in the drawer, and now he was gone, locked in a closet beneath the city, and we still had no idea who had the key. I sat in the chair Saul used to favour when he was waiting to be briefed, debriefed, or subtly insulted by Wolfe for using too many words. The chair didn't say anything, which made it the second quietest thing in the room. I spun slowly, eyeing the desk, the globe, the stack of case files he'd helped crack wide open. Saul Panzer wasn't flashy. He didn't brag. He just got things done. And he always came back. Until now. I went over the facts. He'd been tracing the Wilkson Tunnel lead. He'd sent a warning. He'd vanished. Whoever had silenced him knew what he'd found, or was afraid of what he might. And that token, that damned vintage subway token, wasn't just flair. It meant something. Someone had wanted us to see it. Someone wanted us to know this was more than murder. This was theatre. And Saul was the first act. It was just past 2 when Wolfe finally emerged from the plant rooms. His face was a study in stone. No redness, no tears, no cracks in the marble. But his gait was slower, and his hands stayed clenched a moment too long after he returned to his chair. I didn't speak. Neither did Fritz, who'd set lunch in the dining room but knew better than to call him for it. Wolfe opened a drawer, pulled out a file, and flipped it open without reading. Then he shut it again. Finally, he looked up at me. "We will find who did this." That was it. 6 words. Quiet, clipped, and cold enough to freeze whiskey. "You mean we're taking the case?" "I mean," Wolfe said, "that I shall not permit the murder of Saul Panzer to go unsolved. That is not tolerable." He picked up the receiver and dialed. I waited. The air in the room had shifted. The great Nero Wolfe, who could refuse kings, queens, and half the city's legal bar, had just accepted his first case of vengeance. I spent the next hour digging, and the name popped up like a jack-in-the-box with a grudge. Martin Gennaro, retired MTA systems engineer. Known for his eccentric blueprints and loud objections to how the city handled transit expansion in the 50s. Lived until recently, 1 brownstone over from the Marlings. I found a grainy photo of him at a transit expo circa 1998. White hair, thick glasses, the expression of a man perpetually disappointed in everyone's engineering choices. And the initials? MG. I took the envelope from the train room out of my pocket and stared at it. 4 MG only. It wasn't much, but if Saul had been chasing a map, and Marling's secret files had an envelope meant for a man who lived a block away and probably knew how to short-circuit a city block, then Gennaro wasn't just a name, he was a waypoint. Wolfe had already given the order. Now it was my turn to knock on a door and find out what was waiting behind it. Kramer showed up just after lunch, which meant Fritz had to delay the souffle and I had to delay pretending I wasn't annoyed. He banged the door open like he owned it and stomped in with that face he saves for when he thinks he's cracked something wide open. Wolfe didn't rise, didn't blink. He just shifted in his chair with the vague grace of an elephant reconsidering its position on a throne. Kramer flung a manila folder onto Wolfe's desk. "Your client, Marling's widow. She had motive." Wolfe arched a brow. "Indeed. She hired Panzer, didn't she? You sent him to sniff around her husband's skeletons. Maybe he found something that got him killed." Wolfe sighed. "Inspector, your capacity for assuming the worst is matched only by your inability to differentiate correlation from causation." Kramer glared at me. "You think she's clean?" "I think she wears gloves in July and never blinks," I said. "That makes her careful, not a killer." "She had the most to gain," Kramer insisted. "Then prove it," Wolfe replied, leaning back. "But do not presume guilt because it flatters your narrative." Kramer grunted. "You'll regret shielding her," Wolfe murmured. I regret far worse things, Inspector, including poor grammar. Kramer stood there for a full 10 seconds, jaw working like he was chewing through rusted rebar. Wolfe took a long sip of beer, one of the imported Austrian numbers Fritz had recently reintroduced to the rotation, and dabbed his lips like he was alone. You want a quote for the papers? Kramer growled. Certainly, Wolfe said. Fiat justitia ruat caelum. Kramer blinked. What the hell does that mean? Let justice be done though the heavens fall, Wolfe said. You may add it to your vocabulary, though I doubt you'll use it. Kramer turned on his heel and stomped out, leaving the office 2 degrees colder. When the door clicked shut, Wolfe sighed. A sledgehammer may break rocks, Mr. Goodwin, but it cannot be trusted with sculpture. Meaning? Meaning Kramer is barking up the wrong widow. I nodded. Which leaves us with the blueprint thief, the conductor who vanished, and someone who knows how to kill with symbolism. Wolfe closed his eyes. And perhaps a name hidden in initials. We needed more, so I went out hunting. Douglas Nash lived in a rent-controlled duplex in Queens and looked like he'd been carved from soot and coal dust. His hair was a wiry grey, and his hands were the kind that had touched more voltage than velvet. When I introduced myself, he didn't offer a seat, just a glare and a half scowl. You were Raymond Marling's friend? He asked. Not exactly, I said. Let's say I'm looking into his last few train stops. That got a snort. He was a thief. Dressed it up in hobbies and million-dollar toys, but he was a thief. Of what? Knowledge, blueprints, access. He came to me years ago asking about pre-war signal systems, said it was for a collector's article. Then 2 months later, he had a layout in his basement that matched my diagrams, down to the faulty junction wiring in the Wilson overlay. He tossed a crumpled photo at me. It showed a crude diagram annotated in red pencil, identical to one I'd seen on Marling's wall. You show me a man obsessed with tunnels, Nash growled, and I'll show you someone trying to go where he's not supposed to. Or trying to move something others shouldn't see. That didn't amuse him. Eventually, Nash led me to his garage, which, despite outward appearances, had less to do with cars and more to do with temporal displacement. The inside smelled of oil, old paper, and nostalgia left on the stove too long. One wall was lined with faded MTA posters. A corner was dominated by a vintage control board, complete with knobs, toggle switches, and a speaker that crackled faintly, like it still wanted to report the 510 from Brooklyn. Front and center stood a miniature replica of Grand Central's old train room, complete with its floor plan, elevation models, and an eerily accurate scale of the sealed-off annex. You built this from memory? I asked. Blueprints, he snapped, and 20 years of trying to stop idiots like Marling from treating New York's infrastructure like a personal playpen. He wasn't wrong. The layout included tunnels that shouldn't have been public, some that might have been myth. Marling took this, he said, adapted it, then made it dangerous. I stepped back and took it in. If this was a hobby, it was the kind that could get a man strangled. I left with my brain buzzing, and an idea Wolfe wasn't going to like. Back at the brownstone, I delivered the highlights, minus the parts that smelled like trespassing. Wolfe was in his chair, index fingers tented, eyes half-lidded like a man performing calculus in his sleep. I laid out the theory. The maps aren't just train routes, they're property overlays. Marling wasn't building a hobby. He was tracking underground access, service shafts, legal grey zones, transit corridors beneath valuable real estate. Wolfe nodded. A cartographic Trojan horse. Exactly. And if someone like Clara Nash, or whoever that beige raincoat belonged to, got their hands on it, they'd have invisible access to half the city. Surveillance, Wolfe mused. Smuggling, even blackmail. All wrapped in nostalgia and electric trains. He leaned forward. And Saul. He got too close, traced the source, then got locked in with a vintage token as punctuation. Wolfe picked up the envelope marked MG and tapped it against his palm. These diagrams were not designed to entertain, he said. They were designed to bypass legal definitions of ownership. which makes whoever holds them more dangerous than any widow. He said nothing else, but his eyes had lost all patience. Dinner was braised lamb with root vegetables, which Fritz delivered with a side of concern and an unspoken plea that no arguments erupt before dessert. Theodore joined us halfway through with a dusty stack of orchid records, muttering about an overdue repotting schedule. Wolfe waved him off, uninterested in Phalaenopsis propagation, while murder simmered in his frontal lobe. It wasn't until Fritz mentioned Saul's last visit that the knife slipped a notch on the china. "He didn't use the front door," Fritz said. "That's what surprised me. I assumed you'd let him in through the kitchen." Wolfe blinked. "I did not," Theodore added. "I saw him once, by the orchid room, thought he came through the side corridor. But that's locked." Wolfe froze. His fork hovered in midair, dripping rosemary glaze. "If Saul entered," he said slowly, "without passing the kitchen and without my awareness." He didn't finish the sentence. Because whatever Saul had found, a path, a shortcut, a hidden access, it hadn't stayed secret for long, and it had gotten him killed. Wolfe began pacing. Now, I should clarify. Wolfe pacing isn't like normal people pacing. It's not anxious, it's tectonic. It's what happens when his brain builds a skyscraper of deduction and the elevator's stuck at floor 9. "If Saul accessed the orchid room," he muttered, "he did so via a route unknown to me. Unacceptable. That implies knowledge of the house's original layout or proximity to connected structures. You think the brownstones share something under the surface?" "I think," Wolfe said, "that Saul found an entrance. Perhaps one shared with Marling's train room, perhaps inherited from Gennaro's days with the MTA. Regardless, it was meant to remain unseen." He stopped, turned to me. "Someone has mapped this city's bones, not just for curiosity, but for dominion." "Dominion?" "Yes," he said, "the ability to move, observe, and control, unseen, undetected, the luxury of omniscience without ownership." I whistled low. That's a lot of motive. "And a great deal more risk." He sat. "Mr. Goodwin, find me that tunnel." And just like that, the game had changed, from solving a murder to tracking an invisible empire. I got the call from Kramer's office just after 9. Not Kramer himself, his assistant, who sounded like someone had put vinegar in her orange juice. "You might want to come down to Douglas Nash's place," she said. "He's been found." "Found how?" "Plugged in," she said, and hung up. Nash's garage, already not a welcoming venue, had taken a step deeper into the macabre. The door was wide open, cops milled outside with gloves and cameras, and the smell of burnt metal was fighting the summer air for dominance. Inside, Nash sat at his control desk like he was preparing for a signal test, with one small difference. He was very, very dead. The skin on his hands and neck had gone waxy. His head tilted against the metal relay board, eyes open, mouth slack. Someone had thrown the switch on him, and they hadn't used a dimmer. And to top it off, perched on his head, at a crooked angle, was a vintage MTA conductor's cap. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't kind. But it was, without question, a message. The killer wanted applause. They cleared the room for evidence, and I took a moment to scan the walls. Nash's diagrams were still pinned up, curling at the edges, their ink now smeared from heat or struggle, or both. It was behind the largest one, a map of the 1941 downtown loop, that I found it. Another token, same era, same Y-cut center, same brass glint that had been pulled from Saul's mouth. Only this time, it was taped directly to the back of the map, as if the killer wanted to whisper to us, "You're close, but not close enough." I turned to the officer in charge, who looked like he hadn't slept since the subway cost a nickel. "Anyone touch this?" I asked, pointing to the map. "Nope," he muttered. "Not even Nash. Looks like it was put there post-mortem." Post-mortem. Like punctuation. We'd moved from curiosity to performance art. And whoever was staging these deaths wasn't just a killer. They were composing a sequence. Clara Nash was 29, ran a boutique software firm in Chelsea, and greeted me in a t-shirt with a recursive code joke I didn't bother trying to get. Her hair was pulled back tight, her eyes sharp, and her attitude somewhere between "I've had better mornings" and "say what you need before I block your number." "My uncle's dead," she said. "You're from the PD." "Private sector. I work with Nero Wolfe." That raised one eyebrow, which I took as a miracle. "I'm sorry," I offered. "What happened to your uncle wasn't random." "No kidding," she said. The cap was theatrical. He hated hats. "Did he seem worried lately? Nervous?" She shrugged. "We weren't close, but he'd call when he wanted to complain. The last couple of times, he kept talking about someone he called the Switchman." That got my pulse moving. "You ever meet him?" "Never. Uncle said he called late, always blocked, asked strange questions about access tunnels, about Marling." "Marling?" "Yeah. Said Marling owed him a map." She paused. "And a favour." Clara invited me to sit while she brewed coffee with a machine that looked more complicated than some rocket boosters. The resulting cup came poured over a glass globe of clear ice and handed off like a peace offering. "Where were you last night?" I asked. She didn't blink. "Pitch meeting, Midtown. 4 witnesses, 2 of whom are developers and can't lie without a compiler." "Mind if I check?" "Please do. I back up everything, including my own alibis." She stirred her drink, the spoon clicking like a metronome. "I didn't kill my uncle, Mr. Goodwin. I thought he was a crank." "Maybe. But cranks don't usually end up electrocuted under diagrams of train tunnels." She stared into her glass. "He was obsessed with what he called surveillance-grade access. Said he knew where the old eyes were and how the city used to move quietly underground. That stopped me cold. Surveillance tunnels. Old eyes. If Nash had known the same secrets as Marling, then somebody out there had motive, means, and a thing for vintage tokens. And they were still playing conductor. Back at the brownstone, I laid out the morning's carnage while Wolfe tended to an Onsedium hybrid, with the concentration of a heart surgeon and the disdain of a food critic watching a microwave dinner. He didn't speak until I got to the second token. Then he straightened, wiped his fingers on a linen cloth, and gave the air a long, thoughtful sniff, as if murder had a scent he could identify. "Mr. Nash is the second man involved in transit mapping to be murdered in a manner both symbolic and contrived," he said. "And both men had recent contact with Marling. And both wound up staged like exhibits," I added. Wolfe nodded. "A pattern emerges, not merely in method, but in message. Someone's building a case in reverse." He moved to his desk and tapped the envelope marked MG with a fingertip. "These diagrams," he said, "are not curiosities. They are blueprints for movement and control, that which is unseen beneath our feet." "And what lies under our feet," I said, "might just get us killed." Wolfe didn't argue. He just looked tired and furious. When Wolfe goes into what Fritz calls the strategic silence, the house shifts with it. The air stiffens. Theodore starts overwatering. Fritz gets quieter in the kitchen. Even the orchids seem to lean a little toward the door, wondering when he'll emerge. This time, he locked the plant room from the inside. I knocked once. No answer. Theodore rolled his eyes. He hasn't spoken in over an hour. I suggested misting intervals, and he waved me off like a child with mud on his boots. Fritz brought me a sandwich I didn't ask for and said gently, "Let him be." I didn't argue. If Wolfe was hunting a pattern, he needed solitude, not sass. But the silence was building like pressure under a manhole cover. Whatever Wolfe was seeing in the petals, or the tunnels, was turning sharp. And when Wolfe goes quiet long enough, it means one of two things. Either he's lost the scent, or he's about to pounce. By the time the sun dropped below the west side rooftops, Wolfe still hadn't emerged, and I was half a notebook deep into cross-referencing old MTA tunnel decommissions with Marling's scribbled diagrams, And somewhere between the 36 Wilkson redirection and the 48 Annex seal, it hit me. The killer wasn't just murdering, they were broadcasting. A strangled investigator with a vintage token in his mouth, an electrocuted collector posed in a control chair, cap askew like a crown. Each death wasn't just symbolic, it was positional, like a signal, thrown. I jotted a line in my notebook and circled it. This isn't about death, it's about dominion. That's when the door creaked open, and Wolfe emerged. His face was pale, his eyes laser-locked. He crossed to the globe, poured himself a beer, and downed half in one go. Then, calmly, he said, "The next death will be in the North Quadrant, and it will involve sound." I blinked. Sound. Power. Signal. Control. He glanced at the diagram on my desk. "And if I'm right, Mr. Goodwin, someone intends to finish what Marling started." He set down his glass and smiled. "I've always said Manhattan's got more secrets than a magician's hat, and on Wednesday morning I was staring at one of them, folded 8 times and smelling faintly of bacon grease. It was a blueprint, not just any doodle of ducts and tunnels, but a hand-drawn cross-section of Grand Central's underpants, complete with an arrow pointing to Room 4C, like it was the crown jewels. The blueprint came courtesy of a breakfast-heavy conversation with Mrs. Hilda Renshaw, widow of the late Alfred Renshaw, an MTA lifer who apparently liked hiding things more than maintaining schedules. A little charm, a lot of refills, and exactly one offhand mention of Saul Panzer's name had loosened her tongue. "Oh yes," she'd said, peering over her coffee mug like it might accuse her. "Room 4C. Alfie always said it wasn't just a storage closet. Said it had a phone line that never disconnected, even during the blackout." Her voice trailed off like it was following the phone wire itself. "And," I prodded, "well, someone used to call. Always at night. Never spoke. Just silence." I thanked her and pocketed the blueprint. Time to see what Room 4C wasn't supposed to be. Say what you want about New York. It's loud, it's fast, it smells like ambition and old pizza. But under all that, it's got veins. And I was crawling through one. The blueprint led me past a padlocked service stairwell behind a janitor's locker near track 109. With a little finesse, red bolt cutters and a borrowed uniform, I was descending into a sub-basement no tourist had ever Instagrammed. Pipes hissed like annoyed cats, dust fell like anxious dandruff, and the air tasted like the 1950s had refused to leave quietly. Room 4C wasn't marked, of course. It was a heavy steel door with a brass personnel-only plate, crookedly hanging by one screw. No welcome mat, no keypad, no window, just that quiet dare of forgotten things. The lock was old, the kind that expected to be obeyed, not picked. But someone had beaten me to it. The latch was scratched recently. I pushed it open slow, half expecting to find Jimmy Hoffa playing solitaire. Instead, I got rows of breaker panels, ancient phone switchboards, and a thick smell of burnt insulation. But more than that, I got silence. Not peace. No, this was the kind of silence that watches you breathe and doesn't blink. And on the floor, footprints in the dust. The thing about footprints is, they don't lie, but they do whisper. The ones on the floor of Room 4C were fresh, angled like someone had been pacing. Not marching or wandering, pacing like waiting for a call that might end the war. I followed them around the perimeter until I found the ashtray, metal, old, and full of half-smoked camels. Wolfe might loathe the odour, but to me, it was perfume from a suspect I hadn't met yet. I crouched. The ashes weren't cold. Someone had been here, real recent, and they hadn't locked up behind them. That prickly feeling climbed my neck like a spider in tap shoes. I wasn't alone. Maybe not now, maybe not here, but I'd stepped onto somebody's private stage, and if they'd left footprints and fire, they might be watching to see what I did next. I made a note to keep my back to the wall and my hand near my pocket, because whatever this room was, it wasn't abandoned. It was active, and someone wanted it that way. When I got back to the brownstone, I half expected Wolfe to still be moaning about Fritz's use of paprika in the veal. Instead, he was in the office, arms folded, eyes shut, listening like a man who'd already solved it in his head and was just waiting for me to catch up. I dropped the vintage subway token on his desk. Found this taped behind the old switchboard, same one from Nash's place. He opened one eye. "You've brought another relic." "Nope, brought a pattern." He sighed, reached for the token and laid it next to the others we'd collected. 3 so far, all from different boroughs. Then he did something I hadn't expected. He aligned them on the rug. Not by year, not by serial number, by symbol. And suddenly, I saw it, like dots in a constellation. Each token's logo pointed in a different direction. "Coordinates," he said softly. "They are not tokens. They are directional codes. A rudimentary map." I blinked. "Of what?" He didn't answer, but his lips moved like he was tasting the answer already. "There," Wolfe muttered, tapping the last token into place like it owed him rent. "A schematic of access points. Subterranean." "You mean tunnels?" "Precisely." He leaned back. "Someone has repurposed remnants of the old city. Passages, abandoned by design or neglect, to traverse undetected. An illicit convenience." I leaned over his shoulder. "For what? Smuggling, hiding, or redecorating Grand Central's bones?" "That," he said, "is precisely what we must deduce." The theory had bite. Nash had blueprints. Marling had train maps. Both had histories with underground access, and both had died in ways that screamed statement more than secrecy. "Archie," Wolfe said, closing his eyes, "this is not merely murder, it is architecture in revolt. Someone is orchestrating space, ownership, control." He didn't open his eyes, but his hand drifted toward the bell that summoned Fritz. He would need beer and thinking fuel. I don't usually get tailed unless I've insulted a client's manicure or borrowed a cabbie's hat. But this time, I hadn't even made it past Vanderbilt Avenue when my 6th sense started yanking on my collar. 3 blocks from room 4C, I felt him. Quiet shoes, breath like a yoga instructor. Not a mugger, not a junkie, too controlled. Professional. I ducked left into a deli, then doubled back. He adjusted fast. Too fast. He wasn't just following, he was measuring me. Another block, I spotted my reflection in a storefront, mine and his behind it. I cut across the street and dipped into an alley that smelled like sour milk and something the EPA would rather not know about. He followed. I waited behind a dumpster and gave him a greeting card. A right hook with sarcasm in the ink. He swung back harder. We danced. He slipped. I didn't. By the time I got out, I had a bruised knuckle, a ripped sleeve, and a wallet that still had its contents. But I had something better, a sense that we weren't dealing with a loner. We were dealing with a system. Back at the brownstone, Fritz made a sound halfway between a gasp and a disapproving souffle when he saw my elbow. "I will prepare ice," he muttered like it was a medical oath. Wolfe didn't look up from his chair. "If you were bested in a fistfight, I shall consider revising your salary." "I wasn't bested," I said, settling into my usual seat. "I was interrogated, using knees." I filled him in. The tale, the alley, the fight. Then I pulled out something I hadn't mentioned yet. A torn scrap of fabric from the guy's sleeve. Black, industrial, stamped with faint white lettering. S.Div. Infra. Wolfe finally looked at me. "I submit," he said, "that this is no longer a mere investigation." "No," I said. "It's infrastructure, with a body count." He didn't smile, but he did reach for the beer. Wolfe had a particular way of asking you to do something unpleasant. He'd fold his hands on that oversized belly like he was praying for your soul and say, "Archie, summon them." That was it. No names, no pleas, no explanation. Just them, as if I carried a Rolodex of society's most reluctant attendees in my pocket. But this time, I knew exactly who he meant. 5 people. 5 human oysters who'd rather choke on their own pearls than show up for a date with Nero Wolfe, unless it came with a subpoena or a séance. First was Clara Wexley, who'd stopped pretending to be a concerned philanthropist right around the time Saul's body turned up near Track 23. Then Donald Nash's lawyer, who specialised in squirming. Marling's widow, who had the gaze of a woman who'd buried more than one husband. Vance, the vanished conductor, fresh from his disappearing act. And finally, a city clerk named Perlmutter, who filed things so carefully, even God would need a permit to retrieve them. I made the calls. I used charm threats. And once the phrase, "the alternative is less comfortable," they agreed, barely. The last person to arrive, stomping in like an avalanche of ulcers, was Inspector Kramer. He didn't knock. He never does. That door might as well be a saloon swing the way he treats it. He entered the office with his usual grace, a growl, a scowl, and a hat that looked like it had been kicked into obedience. One glance at the room, which by then had filled with a delightful cocktail of tension and cologne, and his mood took a nosedive. "Goodwin," he barked. "Why am I here, and why am I sitting next to her?" He pointed at Clara like she might bite. Wolfe, unbothered as ever, lifted a pinky in the direction of Fritz, who floated in to serve coffee like it was communion. "You are here," Wolfe said, "because the burden of justice demands witnesses, and your presence, however graceless, lends it credibility." Kramer snorted. "You better have something." Wolfe's eyes glinted. "Oh, I do. You'll want your notebook." Kramer sat. He didn't smile, but he didn't leave. That was victory enough. Of all the faces in the room, Vance's was the most interesting. The man looked like he'd been yanked out of a magician's sleeve mid-trick and hadn't decided whether to be grateful or sue. He wore his conductor's jacket like it was still the 8:15 to Albany, and his eyes flicked around the office like they were late for a transfer. I opened the door for him and gestured politely, which he took as a cue to twitch like a guilty squirrel and step in with the grace of a man who regrets answering his phone. "You're late," I said, handing him a glass of water. "Wolfe doesn't appreciate tardiness unless it's his own." I didn't know what this was about." "You will," I assured him. He took a seat between Nash's lawyer and the city clerk, forming what I privately called the anxiety triangle. Wolfe hadn't spoken yet, but he had leaned back slightly and closed his eyes. That meant he was loading the barrel. And the shot was coming. Wolfe opened his eyes like the sun rising on a battlefield. His gaze swept the room once, pausing just long enough to make everyone consider confessing to things they hadn't done. "What you are about to hear," he began, "is a summation. It lacks poetry, but not clarity." Kramer groaned. "Here we go." Wolfe ignored him. "There exists beneath Grand Central a network of disused tunnels, passages forgotten not by accident, but by bureaucracy and neglect. These spaces have recently found new relevance to parties desiring discretion, secrecy, and access." He flicked a glance at Clara, who didn't blink. "Nash discovered the repurposing first. Marling, an architect by trade and temperament, helped optimize the use. The relay panels in room 4C were manipulated to allow real-time surveillance, audio feeds, signal interference, even misrouting security responses." Vance cleared his throat. Wolfe continued as if swatting a fly. "This infrastructure, invisible to commuters and officials alike, became a lucrative web for smuggling, extortion, and information brokerage." "Sounds like a subway noir," I muttered. "Greed," Wolfe said, "is seldom subtle, but it is effective." And he hadn't even gotten to the murder part yet. Wolfe reached for a folder that Fritz had placed precisely beside the beer tray. He flipped it open, extracted a grainy photo, and held it like a royal decree. "This," he said, "is the device Saul Panzer found." It showed a rusted relay panel embedded in concrete, old, grimy, but very much alive. I'd seen it once, briefly, when Saul first brought it to our attention. What I hadn't seen was the second image Wolfe now displayed, a connection point running under Marling's brownstone, wired through what should have been a defunct fuse box. Saul, Wolfe said, voice flat, confirmed the link between Marling's property and the so-called train room. His knowledge made him a liability. There was a hush that hung in the air like a noose. His death, Wolfe continued, was not random. He was silenced. Kramer swore under his breath. Clara's hands didn't move, but her fingernails began to turn pale. Wolfe replaced the photos. It was a precise removal, clinical, the act of someone protecting a system. And then he turned to Clara. Wolfe didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His words came out like chiseled granite, slow, unyielding, and final. Miss Wexley, your real estate philanthropy was a clever front, but unfortunately, you were clever only in part. Clara lifted her chin. Excuse me. You had access to schematics, donors, zoning loopholes, but your most valuable asset was Room 4C and the relay system Marling built. When he attempted to disengage, you silenced him, chemically. She blinked. Just once. Nash, Wolfe went on, realized the connection and threatened exposure. So you modified the circuitry, introduced an electrical failure, an accident staged but calculated. Kramer leaned forward, eyes narrowing. But it was Saul, Wolfe said softly, who sealed your fate. He knew. And in your panic, you forgot the most critical rule of infrastructure, redundancy. He left a copy. Wolfe gestured. I handed over the microfilm reel Saul had tucked behind his chessboard. Clara stared at it like it might bite. Then her shoulders sagged, just slightly. You don't understand, she whispered. I do, Wolfe said. You built an empire of shadows, but even shadows need walls. And then she moved. Clara was fast. I'll give her that. She cleared the armchair, dodged Kramer's lunge, and made for the hall like she'd rehearsed it. Unfortunately for her, she hadn't rehearsed Fritz. Now, Fritz is many things. Patient, precise, culinary sorcerer. But above all, he's spatially aware. He appeared in the hallway doorway with a linen napkin folded neatly in one hand and the quiet demeanor of a man expecting guests. Clara collided with him at full tilt. The napkin went flying. Fritz did not. She bounced back with a thud, breath knocked out, landing on the polished floor with a grace-free thump. Before she could rise, I was there, restraining her wrist with just enough pressure to encourage surrender. Fritz, unflustered, picked up the napkin, examined it for wrinkles, and nodded. Apologies, he said gently. This hallway is rather narrow. Kramer clapped cuffs on her with grim efficiency. You'll get your damn sherry, Wolfe. Hell, I'll throw in a cask. Wolfe didn't respond. He was already reaching for his beer, and I was left thinking, it always ends like this. One genius, one cop, one napkin, and one hell of a mess. But we weren't done. Not quite. Wolfe had eaten, belched once, apologetically, which meant his brain was doing cartwheels, and taken his throne in the office with all the drama of a Roman senator preparing to sentence the Republic to something unpleasant. Mr. Goodwin, he intoned, the city suffers not from chaos, but from clandestine order. I raised an eyebrow, pen poised. Is that going on a mug, or are we naming suspects? He ignored me, naturally. Clara Nash and Raymond Marling were not merely opportunists. They were architects. They constructed a network of access, concealed under the city's own indifference. Decommissioned tunnels, forgotten switches, and private corridors beneath civic feet. An empire hidden not in shadows, but in negligence. I'd seen the blueprint he was referring to, wrinkled, coffee-stained, and full of enough secrets to make Grand Central blush. Clara and Marling hadn't just plotted the theft of public silence, they engineered it. Each movement, Wolfe said, was strategic, each death structural. When greed is the blueprint, murder becomes the elevator shaft. I jotted that down too, though I suspected I'd need to translate it for Kramer. Wolfe tapped the rolled blueprint with a manicured finger. Begin with Marling. According to Wolfe, and I had no reason to doubt him, especially since he hadn't moved in 2 hours, Raymond Marling had developed the jitters. He didn't want to be part of the tunnels anymore, the scheme, or Clara Nash, possibly not even whiskey. He was a liability, Wolfe said, and Miss Nash, being efficient, resolved liabilities. The method was simple and classic, Scotch with a twist. In this case, a twist of powdered foxglove, Wolfe's preferred term for what the medical examiner would probably call digitalis. She served it to him during one of their routine meetings, Wolfe said, voice dry. A minor heart issue, exaggerated by a foreign additive. And no one questions death in a man already stressed by lawsuits and subterranean sins. I made a note to never accept drinks from women who use blueprints as lingerie. Clara, Wolfe added, did not mind blood, but she preferred her hands clean. That is more dangerous. We weren't done. There was still a fried man with a train token on his chest. Douglas Nash was an engineer with principles and, tragically, a sense of curiosity. That's like being a cat with a suicide wish. Wolfe said, Nash was not an accomplice. He was an obstacle. Once he discerned the tunnel routes beneath the Nash property and their real purpose, Miss Nash found him inconvenient. Zapped inconvenient, I added. Yes, a precise application of electrical current routed through his workbench. With a theatrical flourish, the MTA conductor's cap, no doubt intended as a flourish of her peculiar humour. He leaned back and closed his eyes. It was not only death, it was communication. To who? I asked. He opened one eye. To us. The train token had been a flare, a calling card with vintage charm and deadly intent. Clara had begun leaving breadcrumbs the moment she knew she was being sniffed at. And speaking of sniffers, Saul had followed those tokens like a hound. Unfortunately, what he found had teeth. Saul Panzer never missed a beat, unless someone turned off the metronome and brained him with it. He'd followed the tokens like a priest decoding relics, one at Nash's bench, one behind the old MTA map, and the third, as Wolfe revealed, in Marling's basement. Each token wasn't just nostalgic, it was a coordinate, a breadcrumb, a dare. Wolfe's voice dropped a shade. He discovered the final tunnel entrance, a forgotten service hatch behind the south stairwell of Grand Central, wired to the same relay board Nash had been repairing. He entered. He did not exit. They shut the door on him? I asked. Wolfe nodded, and choked him with theatre. Rigging. A prop rope from the maintenance crew's stockpile. Clara must have timed it perfectly. Saul had no time to fight. There was a pause. I didn't write. Neither did Wolfe speak. Then, it was not personal, Mr. Goodwin. Merely structural necessity. Which is why, I said, I'm not crying, I'm boiling. Wolfe steepled his fingers. Now, the collapse. Wolfe, who rarely quoted anyone unless dead and Latin, opted for the dramatic this time. In all things balance, in all impulses, elegance. He looked directly at Clara Nash, seated stiffly in the red chair with all the poise of a spider in a courtroom. Your elegance, Miss Nash, was in your architecture. Your impulse, in your inheritance. Both collapsed the moment you took a life. She blinked once, then again, then dropped her gaze. I didn't mean to, she started. Wolfe lifted a dismissive hand. Spare us the indulgence of revisionist morality. You meant to achieve dominion. You merely underestimated gravity. Of guilt, of justice, of infrastructure. Her hands trembled. The others in the room stayed silent. Even Kramer, who was watching like a man seeing a car wreck in reverse. Clara Nash crumpled like a pressed dress under steam. She confessed, not in shouts or sobs, but in brittle, fractured sentences. Names, routes, timelines. Fritz appeared quietly with a silver tray and a phone already connected to downtown. Inspector, Wolfe said, If you please. But we weren't entirely done. There was still a little insult left in the bottle. Kramer showed up an hour later, breathing like someone had dared him to climb stairs. He tossed a bottle onto the office table. Sherry, medium dry, from a brand Wolfe tolerated but did not admire. Don't say I never bring peace offerings. Wolfe, in his armchair and at his full imperial height, mentally, peered at the label. Passable. That's all you're getting, Kramer growled. You cracked it, but I still don't like you. That, Wolfe said, is a comfort. If you admired me, I should have to question my methods. I coughed politely and reached for the corkscrew. Shall I serve the treaty, gentlemen? Bah, Kramer muttered. You'll write it up like I sat in the corner chewing my badge. I smiled. No, sir. I'll say you growled it into submission. He scowled harder, which meant he liked it, just not enough to admit it. We toasted, grudgingly. But something was still scratching at me. A set of initials Wolfe hadn't explained. There was one thing Wolfe hadn't explained, which in itself was an event worthy of champagne and fainting spells. The notes Clara left behind were full of dry, mechanical annotations, and one recurring signature. MG. Could have been Marling, I said, tossing it out like bait. Or someone helping him. Wolfe merely sniffed. Irrelevant. Now, when Wolfe uses that word, it could mean any of three things. It's genuinely irrelevant, it's too trivial for his elevated cortex, or it's personal, and I'm not on the guest list. So I tried another angle. You think Clara was writing those notes to someone alive? No, he said, closing his eyes. I think she was writing to a memory. That shut me up for a beat. She designed tunnels, Mr. Goodwin, he murmured. But perhaps she also needed someone to walk them with. When that person disappeared, she kept writing. I poured myself a second glass of the passable sherry. Sometimes in this line of work, the case closes clean, but the doors underneath stay open. In the end, it wasn't the tokens or tunnels that mattered. It was the choices made in darkness, the quiet turns of greed where no one was meant to look. Clara built her empire on secrets that hummed beneath the streets, believing perhaps that if no one saw the crime, it couldn't stain her soul. But justice, like Wolfe, has a way of waiting, silent, immovable, inevitable. Do you believe Clara was a villain, or just an architect of desperation? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoyed the mystery, be sure to like the video, share it with someone who loves detective stories, and subscribe for more. Not every case ends with applause, but the truth, once found, always echoes.